If one of my colleagues, thank you so much, Priscilla. Welcome, everyone. I'll do another welcome. You're all here for advancing equity through collaboration, human trafficking, and sexual assaults. This webinar is hosted by Valor and will be facilitated by our partners at CAST. So a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. I know many of us have been on Zoom for a long time now, but the way that we'll be running things today is if anybody has any questions or anything they want to comment on, please use the chat function. This is a really huge webinar, so we won't be allowing folks to unmute themselves. But if you do have any questions, again, please drop that in the chat. Let us know if someone missed a question. Feel free to private message me and let me know. I will be relaying questions to our presenter. And for folks that are on dialing in from their phones, make sure that if you want to unmute yourself at some point near the end of the webinar to ask a question, go ahead and you'll use *6 to unmute yourself or mute yourself. Folks, we will also have slides and the recording available after this webinar. So if you missed a part of it or you want to send this to one of your colleagues, we will be posting that on both the CAST website and on the Valor website. And we will make sure to email everybody or actually send you a newsletter with the recording. And a little bit about confidentiality. I think all of us are really well aware of confidentiality and wanting to make sure that we aren't sharing anyone's specific stories here. If you have, knowledge that you gain from this webinar, we absolutely want you to go ahead and share that with your colleagues at your organization. And then last but not least, a note on self-care. I know oftentimes many of us are taking trainings on trauma-informed care, and many of those trainings include stories about survivors of trafficking or domestic violence and sexual assault. So just because we're used to learning about those topics doesn't mean that sometimes we may need to take a break, get a glass of water, use the restroom, check in with a friend or a colleague. So please do what you need to take care of yourselves. And a little bit about Valor. We are a organization, that's part of a national movement to end sexual violence in partnerships with survivors and other anti-oppression movements through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, education, research, advocacy, and public policy. We provide leadership and resources to a strong network of advocates, crisis professionals, volunteers, and community partners that make up California's safety net for survivors of sexual violence. And together we promote the best interests of survivors and advocates for systems and policy change that end sexual violence. So before we get started, I just want to introduce myself and my staff. We will be your tech support. So if anybody needs any support, feel free to private message any of the three of us up here. I'm Marcela Rojas. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the project managers here at Valor. I oversee a couple different projects, so I will drop my email in the chat if anybody has any particular questions about our work here at Valor. And then I'll pass it over to Priscilla and Claudia to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Priscilla Clausen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a project coordinator at Valor, and I will also put my email in the chat box in case anyone wants to reach out to me for support. And Claudia, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you, Priscilla. Hi, everyone. My name is Claudia Cibaja. I use pronouns she, her, ella, and I'm happy to be here today. And I will also put my email in case anyone needs to send an email for tech support. Welcome.
Thank you, Bo. So now we are going to introduce our wonderful presenter over at CAST, Lee LaChapelle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lee. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Associate Director of Survivor Advocacy with the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking in Los Angeles. In my role, I oversee our survivor leadership programming. I support both our national and local lived experience leadership. I also oversee and support our local, state, and federal public policy initiatives. But my background is in direct services for many, many years with CAST, and actually starting at rape crisis centers. That's where I did the majority of my work before I got into the anti-trafficking movement.
Thanks so much, Lee. And a shout out to Lee also, because Lee did a lot of work with incarcerated survivors, and I'm seeing some folks in the chat saying hello who also do some work with incarcerated survivors. So Thank you for bringing all your knowledge into the webinar, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Awesome. Okay.
And everyone, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. This is a really big group, so I appreciate being able to see everyone's names and where you're coming from.
Okay. All right. Please use the chat function. And again, utilize the wonderful Valor staff if you have any tech issues. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat and keep an eye on my presentation and all of your lovely faces. So I'm really grateful to be here today. This presentation actually it came out of some work that Cast and Valor were doing together to increase collaborations and understanding between the human trafficking and sexual assault sectors. Historically, there's been some of a disconnect. There's also been a lot of great work and overlap. And so we just want to continue to dive into what that looks like. Today, there was going to be with me my co-facilitator, Chris, who is the program manager for the National Survivor Network. Unfortunately, they had a family emergency. They could not make it today. So I'm going to do my best to do their sections of the presentation that they developed, but I won't do it quite as good as them. So just bear with me on some of that today. But first I want to have some kind of like group agreements, some ground rules. I really want today's presentation to allow for nuance and learning outside of our comfort zone. A lot of times in advocacy spaces, there is this idea that there's one correct way of practice, of praxis, and I want to lean into today that you might hear some things that go against what you've been taught or what you've learned, and we just want to open a learning space, and we want to open that multiple things can be true, they can be complicated, and they can require further learning. I also want to recognize that there is room in the anti-violence sector for differing opinions, and specifically that this space is a learning space and not a debate space. So oftentimes in trainings, if you hear things you might disagree with, you might be tempted to take to the chat and really, name that disagreement. And I do welcome people naming their opinions, but just recognizing that this is a space I was brought into to deliver a training and to facilitate some conversation. It's not really going to be a space where we dive into debate or follow other tangents because we have a lot to get through in our 2 hours together today. I also want to recognize that there's no one person who's an ultimate authority of knowledge in the human trafficking field. All of us that are in the human trafficking fields come with our own spheres of privilege and oppression and lived experience and professional experience that are going to really shape the way that we give training, that we give our opinions, that we engage with others, and just recognize that everything in here today, take what serves you and what interests you and what leads you to further conversations and leave what doesn't. And just know that there is going to be a feedback form at the end and ways that you can give feedback to me as well. Just because I'm here giving this training doesn't inherently mean that I know more than you or that I can't also learn from you in this space. And I want to have everybody take care of themselves. And we say that a lot, but I do mean if you need to leave, that's fine. If you need to disengage, that's also fine. There is going to be some very heavy material today. We're going to go over the history, in part, very brief history of the human trafficking movement politically. And that involves some historical content that we're going to bring forward, some direct historical references that are racist and homophobic and transphobic and xenophobic. And they are very important that we look at them in the context of the history of human trafficking movement. But I just want everybody to take care of themselves in any way that you need to. So what are our objectives today? We want to review how the human trafficking movement or sector, and specifically the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, has led to the criminalization and coercive intervention of survivors, and how that intersects with the sexual violence movement. What does that mean for you all in this room who are working at rape crisis centers? We also are going to briefly dive into more of a public health model of violence intervention, including risk and protective factors that can be predisposing, enabling, reinforcing, and how they exist across behaviors and attitude and environment. And we're going to have a focus on demand reduction. and how that might detract from a comprehensive public health approach. One of the things that you will often hear from me and folks at my agency and trainings is that there is an unequal emphasis on sex trafficking within the movement that we're going to dive into a little bit today. But one of the reasons that we're focusing on this today and not bringing as much of some of the tactics around labor trafficking today is because this is the most common area and topic that rape crisis centers are requesting education on. What is demand reduction? How does it fit into a public health framework? Does it fit into a human rights framework? What are the impacts? All of these things. We also want to identify concrete strategies to engage with different typologies of anti-trafficking advocate. This is Chris's really cool section where they have a really awesome way to break down different types of advocates who have different positionalities and knowledge bases around equity and end demand, and how to effectively collaborate, how to engage in conversation in effective ways that are potentially going to be more productive. So this section is actually about Chris's background, but our backgrounds are very similar. So I myself am a trafficking survivor. I am a child trafficking survivor who engaged in street-based survival sex work under force, fraud, and coercion under the age of 18. I also engaged in consensual adult sex work, not under any force, fraud, or coercion as a young adult. And my first job ever, besides like, you know, engaging in like the type of sex work I was doing, and then also other jobs that young people often engage in. Like I was a dancer at some point. I worked in restaurants, etc. My first like job that I felt set kind of the building blocks for my career and put some of my experiences into a context and a framework was working at a rape crisis center. I was a hotline advocate and eventually managed all of the direct services for the Rape Crisis Center in my town for many, many years. And when I got involved in that work, providing non-judgmental services to sex workers felt easy. We didn't really discuss human trafficking a ton at my Rape Crisis Center. It was in the rural South. It was not a topic that we'd fully unpacked yet. Even some rape crisis centers in California are still kind of unpacking like what is human trafficking, and we know we're serving survivors, but what does that mean? We hadn't had that conversation yet, but we had the conversations around serving sex workers meant that there were different safety planning that we did, but other than that, it was very similar. Our values were very similar. They weren't necessarily different clients. It was an easy thing to integrate into our value system. But we were starting to untangle some, as a group of survivors who worked at this rape crisis center, some of us who had been trafficked, some of us who had engaged in sex work consensually, some of us who hadn't. What were our feelings around the concept of sex work, around buyers, around clients, even from consensual times? So I myself had not great feelings about sex work as a young person who had been trafficked as a child and also had engaged with it out of economic need. And how did I start to untangle all of those things in the context of working at a rape crisis center? That was one thing that felt a little bit easier to do working at a rape crisis center, but then I moved into the anti-trafficking sector almost on accident. I had avoided it for a while because it didn't feel like it spoke to my values to work within it, but I did end up being moved and called into that work. And when I did get to that work, I noticed something happening that almost felt like standing in front of a funhouse mirror. I was hearing the same words that I heard in the rape crisis centers, but they had different meanings, or they were being used in different contexts. I heard a lot of things about, we have non-judgmental, services that meet clients where they are. But I was noticing much different program restrictions. I was noticing very interesting policy choices that didn't really speak to bodily autonomy or consent or being trauma informed, a lot more coercive interventions, a lot more reliance on law enforcement than I had seen in the sexual violence movement. And I became very disillusioned, but mostly I became really confused. Because all of a sudden I went from a space that, was definitely unpacking some complicated feelings, but didn't judge sex workers, to a space that did judge sex workers, specifically those who were not experiencing trafficking. But I knew that I didn't judge sex workers. I knew I didn't want them to experience discrimination or criminalization. But entering the human trafficking movement, I had only heard of one tactic, and that was end demand. And I was wondering if there was something I didn't understand. The conversations were very different. I was getting met with different reactions. If I said something like, yeah, this policy that we've introduced, it could be good, but how do we make sure that people engaged in the sex trade are safe? I would be met with the response of, why don't you care about children being trafficked? Which wasn't the question I asked, and seemed like a very hostile kind of straw man argument, very divisive, really meant to shut down conversation. I would ask, okay, maybe this model of criminalization or of harm reduction, what is this going to do to keep people who use drugs safe? What is this going to do to keep people who are engaged in the sex trade out of need safe? And I would be met with, why do you care more about buyers than survivors? Being myself a survivor, that was very difficult to hear. But there was a lot of tactics being used to kind of shut down any widening of the movement to include different perspectives. And that's just important to know, like, where I was, because I want to recognize that everybody in this room is going to be in a different place today. We're all going to be in very different levels of understanding, of processing, and just know that a lot of the people that you see started maybe at similar places to you, and that learning is a really complicated process. But one of the things that I did realize in my background is that I knew in my core that trafficking prevention and sex worker safety were not incompatible. I just knew this inherently as somebody who had experienced both. I knew that these two things could coexist in one movement. And I knew it was really complicated. And I knew that people agreed with me. There were a lot of people that were like, yeah, I don't really love the current norms of this work. Or even, I think the like norms of this work are harmful, but they didn't know how to name them, and they didn't know how to do anything different. And when I started asking, why don't we speak up more? Why don't we push back against these harmful funding streams? Why don't we do this? I heard a lot of things about funding and a lot of things about fear. Fear of retaliation, fear of pushback, fear of harassment, and also just loss of funding. We'll get into today the interesting funding structures in the human trafficking movement that exist. But one of the things that when I started asking questions, I realized that a lot of times we were asking the wrong questions. So a lot of the questions that I heard being asked is like, how effective are John schools, which are programs that are designed primarily for cis men, that convince them that engaging in commercial sex as a client or a buyer is inherently exploitative, usually through some sort of scare tactics about like, this is so-and-so, he lost his job and his wife won't talk to him anymore. How effective are those? Instead of asking, what is already in the existing research about shame-based strategies for sexual behavior control? And does that as a tactic generally work? Or does it drive things further underground? People asking, does asymmetrical criminalization, which is end demand, or some people refer to it as the Nordic model, does that reduce sex work, right? Instead of maybe, does that make survivors safer? Does it make their access to safe immigration, safe housing, public benefits? Does it increase their access to the things? Does it make them safer? Or does it simply reduce sex work? How can we reduce the sex trade so that fewer people will be trafficked, which is kind of like a core belief of end demand or of other models of criminalization, that we do reduce the sex trade, we will reduce the number of people that are being trafficked. Instead of maybe asking, how can we ensure that nobody who does not want to engage in the sex trade is without better economic option? How can we increase option, increase economic stability, increase access to resources so that folks are not without better options? And when I started to ask some of the questions on the right, I got a lot of pushback. I've been told that I'm not an actual survivor, that the trafficking I experienced as a child must have not been that bad, or that I'm not fully healed somehow to maybe want to ask questions about sex worker safety or sex worker rights. And I acknowledge that these are really challenging conversations, especially for those of us with lived experience, or for those of us as service providers who have seen a lot of horrible things, who have talked to a lot of survivors about their existence, both consensually or non-consensually within the sex trade, that was really harmful or really violent or very challenging. Sometimes that can cause us to want to shut down some of this conversation that is really difficult to untangle, is really nuanced. But I think there can absolutely be space for these types of conversations. It's hard. It requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of learning. It requires a lot of openness, but I think we can ask all of these questions. So the history of the human trafficking movement. This is a huge topic that I think deserves like its own podcast series, run by many, many people who are not me, who can bring different nuanced perspectives to this conversation, because it also aligns with the history of many different social movements. But we're going to just talk about a few key pieces that have really contributed to the modern day human trafficking sector. So human trafficking in the United States, it is really difficult to talk about this conversation because people start in the 90s or the 2000s with the Human Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And we start there. And that's a really inappropriate place to start this conversation because it starts in a time in which human trafficking is illegal, in which the trafficking of human bodies for sex and labor is illegal. And that is not the history of the United States. So in the United States, the entire foundation of our country was on the genocide and enslavement of people from native cultures. That is the very core of our nation's history, as well as the transatlantic slave trade from the 15 to 1800s. So human trafficking was not a word at this time because it was a legal practice that was government funded and was the very core of our morals, our belief system inherently was genocide and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as chattel slavery up until 1865. Post 1865, there's a lot of history, but one of the most important things here is that in 1865, the 13th Amendment to make human trafficking and slavery illegal, to change that in our country's law. This is when that occurred, but the 13th Amendment left what some call a loophole, others call a purposeful kind of sentence there, where you cannot enslave someone for the purposes of labor, with the exception of punishment for a crime. So what that means is that human trafficking and slavery is still legal in the United States within the prison industrial complex. And a lot of the labor that we receive our goods from in the United States is made within the context of that labor. And so you will see that in the history of the human trafficking movement, unlike the sexual violence movement, there's not a lot of advocacy around incarcerated survivors. And the reason for that is all incarcerated survivors pretty much are experiencing what is by definition labor trafficking. It is just considered okay under current law. There are lots of efforts to change that, but you will not see many human trafficking service providers who are engaging in that type of advocacy because of this history of the human trafficking movement. So in all of our history, we did not neatly break into two categories, sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Domestic servitude, sexual violence, labor exploitation, what we commonly refer to now as commercial sexual exploitation. This was all happening throughout the genocide and enslavement of native cultures and through the transatlantic slave trade. But we did not consider them separate things. And this kind of history leads us to where we are pre-Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So pre the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is what we often refer to as white slavery pandemic or epidemic, and also the moral virtue of white men. So you can track through US history post throughout the Jim Crow era that there was a moral panic due to several things converging. One is that white women were occupying public space and freedoms in a more public way, and that included engaging in sex work. We also had this belief that that would threaten the moral upstandingness of white men. So there's a lot of writings on how the freedoms of white women, especially their freedom to engage in sex work, and they say freedom, but this sex work was both done out of economic need, it was done through force, fraud, and coercion, it was done for many, many reasons, not to say that it was all without force, fraud, or coercion, but any white woman engaging in sex work was a moral threat to kind of the moral virtue of white men. We also had a really high convergence of the way that Black and brown and immigrant men were being vilified and criminalized and falsely accused of sexual violence by white women, and moral outrage surrounding interracial relationships. And there were many laws specifically that were created to criminalize interracial relationships, to stop Black and brown men from being able to travel with white women, from being able to visit white women. There was all of these things happening at once that really led to quite a bit of media that you can now consume that really moralized, really moralized the virtue of white women. And one of these quotes is from basically trying to persuade other white countries, of what we consider white countries, to not send their young women to the United States because of this moral pandemic that they would engage in the sex trade. So one of these quotes is, "Make Irish girls stay at home to starve and die. Let them die in their virgin purity, attended by their priests. Their deathbeds will be illuminated by the light of faith and the hope of glorious resurrection." The reverend here, "I would not allow women at all in the streets. It is the looseness and freedom of these women who can walk the streets at night that have tended to the immorality of our youth and advancement for years." So a lot of this framing was not around the safety of women, but around the safety of their virtue, protecting their virtue and their virginity, and protecting men. And you can see a lot, if you Google the white slavery, like the Great War on White Slavery or anything about white slavery, you will find a lot of literature. There's a lot of literature made and passed out on this time, creating moral panic around fighting for the protection of white women at the hands of men of color or in the sex trade. And so this was a lot of the history of the human trafficking movement that the human trafficking movement doesn't really like to recognize, but these same concepts and ideals were what led us to, the modern human trafficking movement. And you can see there's lots of racist imagery. I would not recommend reading any of these. I would just give a big content warning on the information that exists within them. But they are very, very important to kind of understand where we are. And so again, more content warnings, but these are some of the, and Leah just put the Mann Act of 1910, the Wikipedia article on that. That is one of the many pieces of anti-Black legislation that came out in regards to this kind of like white slavery moral panic that existed in the United States. And so there are many quotes about this, but this is just two where oftentimes during this period of US history, the white slavery pandemic was compared to and considered worse than chattel slavery in the United States. And these are really terrible quotes, but they are incredibly important because these same people making these quotes are going to be the legislators that are doing important human trafficking work, or that are the foundations of the organizations that currently do human trafficking work. And this very concept of we must save pure women from this crime. So now we get to recent history. Like this is all the buildup. This is what the buildup is to the modern day human trafficking movement. This was the first attempted piece of legislation, the Freedom from Sexual Trafficking Act of 1999. This got a lot of pushback. And the reason this got a lot of pushback is because it was the first human trafficking law, and it explicitly ignored labor trafficking. It did not include labor trafficking, even though the majority, a very high number of labor trafficking survivors experience sexual violence or sexual harassment as part of their force, fraud, and coercion of their trafficking. And the representative that wrote this piece of legislation, Chris Smith, actually said the problem in addressing all of these evils in one bill is that they involve a wide array of different situations. So we decided to start by attacking the most brutal and important form of human trafficking, which is sex trafficking. So this set the stage in the United States for the emphasis on sex trafficking being worse, more important, and more deserving of attention than labor trafficking. And it wasn't until I got to do some global human trafficking work that I met with stakeholders in other countries that I got to go to, survivor-led organizations in other parts of the world, that there isn't as strong as a distinction between sex and labor trafficking in non-US centered movements, and that there's actually a very blended understanding, and that all of those forms of oppression are interconnected, and that workers' rights exist both in the sex trade and in all other forms of labor, and similar tactics will, lead people to liberation and having their human rights respected. But in the US, we have set the stage kind of for sex trafficking being considered an other. So we get to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This is still the law that's used. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is still what you are going to hear about most often. It is still the thing that we work on most often. And so what we're looking at here is learning about what happened to sex trafficking, the definition of sex trafficking, while this was being developed. This was a very big fight. I was not a part of this. I was not in public federal policy yet. But I worked with many people who were there in the meetings while this was kind of being discussed, while we really decided, okay, we need one bill that addresses both sex and labor trafficking. Nobody fought over the definition of labor trafficking. People didn't really want it included, but nobody really fought over the definition. We kind of all agreed about what labor trafficking looked like. We didn't really all agree on the tactics, but there wasn't really a big debate on what definition we're including. There was a very big debate on what is the definition of sex trafficking. And so there was a compromise. We ended up with slightly different and separate definitions. And so we have a non-operational and an operational definition. So the definition of sex trafficking as it stands is it's sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. Right? So we have force, fraud, and coercion, or the person is under 18. There is also a non-operational definition of sex trafficking in which we don't identify it as a crime, but we do say that it kind of includes all commercial sex, can be included in that broad definition. But our operational definition is what determines what is like actionably a crime. And it's also what is referred to, and you may have heard this definition and been like, huh, is the term severe forms of trafficking in persons. So this term confuses a lot of people in the movement, especially those outside of the movement, because when you hear the term severe form of trafficking in persons, you might think that severity has to do with the crime involved, that it must be like severe in terms of length or duration or force. Severe simply means that there's force, fraud, or coercion. It just means that it meets the operational definition of trafficking. Because there is a non-operational definition there that kind of refers to all commercial sex. And so like, why was this included? Well, during these initial conversations, it was not just human trafficking service providers that were at the forefront of this. The human trafficking movement in its foundation was founded by a lot of anti-pornography and religious organizations. So you may hear me switch between the words sector and movement quite a bit. And that's because I don't feel comfortable quite with either word. So sector is usually referred to as people outside of the problem came together to address the problem. That's a sector. A movement is generally people impacted by the problem got together in grassroots ways to address the problem and help each other. Sexual violence, domestic violence, those are movements generally led by people who have lived experience. Human trafficking was not necessarily a movement. I wouldn't even maybe say that it's a movement now, even though there's been a lot of progress there. It was founded not by people who were impacted, but by people who were outraged, right? So that leads us to a very different kind of movement. So in this room, we have a lot of people, some who've been doing human trafficking work for a long time, some who are agencies like Morality in Media or other kind of like second wave feminist campaigners, religious folks who would like to see this piece of legislation used to criminalize all of sex work and consider all sex work trafficking, regardless of if there's force, fraud, and coercion. So that didn't happen, but we still do have these very confusing kind of multiple definitions, some operational, some non-operational, and that's honestly led to a lot of confusion in the movement. And because of that, the TVPA lists demand as a prevention strategy. right? Because that was a big fight that a lot of people wanted to see, is that the demand for sex work being listed as something that we need to address as a form of prevention, even though there was not evidence behind it, that it was an effective prevention strategy, and was not considered an effective prevention strategy in other public health spheres, like in the HIV/AIDS movement, like in the drug and alcohol use movement. Ending demand and criminalization were not tactics that were utilized very heavily, but in the human trafficking movement, we kind of exceptionalized trafficking and moral outrage, and we did kind of start to look at demand as an effective strategy. So when we're looking at who are some of these folks involved, Morality in Media is a big name, and they're still a very large organization. They were at the time, you know, in those rooms, looking at those definitions, really advocating for certain things. They are now called the National Center for Sexual Exploitation. They changed their name in 2015, and they stated earlier this year, we changed our name from Morality in Media to the National Center on Sexual Exploitation to better describe our organization's scope and mission, which remains the same as it always has. Many of the big players in the human trafficking movement, the largest organizations, started as anti-pornography or faith-based morality in media type organizations. They often have shifted to, you know, sexual exploitation or sexual violence or other things because it is a better strategic position to be in for policy. And because, you know, oftentimes the care of children is really at the core. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the nuances here in anti-trafficking resources and ideology, because I know I sound a bit harsh, but I promise I'm not. So one of the things that we talk about is, especially for folks who maybe are super radical, they're like, I totally get why, you know, these things have happened. They may see a well-funded faith-based organization and see people who hate sex workers. And they may see an anti-pornography organization and just see them as people who hate sex workers. They might see anti-sex Puritans or other like anti-sex, you know, criminalizing adult sexual identity, sexual behavior, sexual relationships. They may see people who hate sex workers, people who hate sexual freedom, but that's really reductive of who these people are. A well-funded faith-based organization is often made up of people who care about children, and they're looking for resources to keep them safe. Well-funded anti-pornography organizations are often full of people who worry about the objectification of women. They're looking for resources to address misogyny. And oftentimes when we are talking about anti-sex Puritans, what we're really talking about is people who are worried about subtle dynamics of, you know, coercion. They want resources to address manipulation. They're worried about the way in which societal norms impact our ability to consent. And so why I like to do this is because I like to find common ground as a jumping off point for learning. And I think that many people, the vast majority of people who enter the human trafficking movement are very well intentioned. And I think intentions are important. I do not think they're necessarily more important than our impact, but I do think that at the core, they're very important. But what happens when all of these people on the bottom, people who care about children, people who are worried about the objectification of people in the sex trade, people who are worried about dynamics of coercion, they want to address misogyny, they want to address manipulation, what happens when they enter the human trafficking movement? What are they going to find? Most often, they are going to find well-funded human trafficking nonprofits who say things like the word sex work is offensive to survivors, and women in the sex trade are prostituted and they're not for sale. We have to end demand, and there's an epidemic where we need to go and we need to save all of these women. These are like common things you can find on anti-trafficking websites. This is common rhetoric that you can find. This is what you're going to find out there. And this, on a surface level, for somebody who cares about children, who cares about consent, who cares about coercion, these things are going to resonate. What you're not going to find is grassroots organizations or outside of the human trafficking movement, trans-led organizations, immigrant-led organizations, where they are talking about human rights and harm reduction. They're doing street-based outreach. They are on the ground. They're led by survivors. They're not well-funded, and they don't, you know, have salary for people who just do communications and media and website design in order to be kind of like on the top of that Google search. And they might not, those people who care about consent and power dynamics and coercion, they might not find these resources. So what they are going to find is what we kind of call the low-hanging fruit of new advocates. And the reason that you find it is because it's accessible, it's common, it's well marketed, it's funded, it's glossy, and it's presented in ways that make it really, you can't disagree with it because it shuts down rather than invites dialogue. So if I say, I'm really worried about why members of my community are more susceptible to trafficking, but I don't want them to be arrested for engaging in sex work. Why do you care more about traffickers than you care about children? You know, when we want to talk about restorative justice, when we want to talk about taking care of our community as a whole, when we are curious as to why members of our community are engaging as traffickers, what happens in someone's life history that makes them traffic someone else, and we want to know why that happens, you will often get shut down in that you don't care about the survivors here. And so what are some of the contradictions? This is one of the reasons that we're doing this training is because we are approached often by sexual violence advocates who are saying, I'm not understanding the difference in values in the human trafficking movement. Like, things aren't resonating for me. I don't really understand why we have to engage in some tactics and in others. So oftentimes the values you're going and norms that you see shift the most are around bodily autonomy, are around harm reduction, around self-determination and supporting survivors' decisions, around acknowledging the systematic failure of institutions, and around divestment from the criminal legal system and non-punitive orientations. So these are all things that when I started working at a rape crisis center, even in the most rural of areas, in the most conservative of areas, which is where I grew up, these were, from the start, there was no talk about these. Like, we knew that we didn't blame survivors for the things that happened to them. We knew that harm reduction was imperfect, but important. We met people where they were. We didn't determine how they should identify or what choices they should make. We supported them. We met them where they were. We didn't force them to report to law enforcement because we recognized that the law enforcement systems, one, have a history of, like, oppressive structure, and that leads us to our current day. So we know that all survivors, specifically survivors of color, survivors with disabilities, they're not safe with law enforcement. We recognize that those cases aren't going to court. We recognize all of these things are happening. Thank you. Somebody sent a message. Thank you, Sarah. And we know that we are divesting, right, from the criminal legal system. We are using more community-oriented things. When I worked at the Rape Crisis Center, I actually did have to lead a lot of the task force meetings, but I did that because I had a lot of survivors who did want to report. I was like, okay, well, we're gonna do the best we can with this relationship, but it may be imperfect. We know it's harmful to engage. We know that our survivors are going to experience harm in this system. So what else can we do? Can we be in clinics? Can we be, doing street-based outreach that doesn't involve law enforcement? You're going to see some of these tactics not pan out in the human trafficking movement. And there's a couple of reasons why. And so one of those reasons is the anti-prostitution pledge. Has anybody heard of that? Has anybody seen that? Have you tried to apply for funding and you've seen that come up? A lot of people aren't actually familiar. So the anti-prostitution pledge is language that exists in many anti-violence and public health streams. And it was enacted in 2003, and it exists mostly in federal, but also in a lot of state funding streams, that we cannot, as grantees, promote or support the legalization or practice of prostitution. So this is the exact language that we pull. So what does this mean? What does this mean, right? Oftentimes, sharing safety resources or research is seen as promoting the practice of sex work or sex trafficking. So these clauses have hindered our ability and our advocacy efforts, and they interrupt the way that we can do harm reduction. And because of that, they increase vulnerability to trafficking in the sex trade. So there are many really wonderful grassroots agencies that are not eligible to apply for funding that's anti-trafficking work because of the harm reduction work that they do with survivors. And in no other funding streams are there stipulations like this pledge that exist within the human trafficking movement. This clause also limits survivor self-determination agency by forcing them to frame their experiences in government-sanctioned ways. Something that blew my mind in the human trafficking movement is that there was like, you had to kind of qualify for services and on the front end share quite a bit about your experiences to make sure that it met this federal definition, or that they felt that you know, maybe were a victim enough, you know, to be within the sex trade. Something else that surprised me is that during my first job, I was working with a survivor. Of course, I was an emergency response case manager. I was working with a survivor who wanted to exit the sex trade and go to school. But there are many steps in between those things. So in the interim, she had presented the idea of switching from in-person street-based sex work to kind of like online platforms. And we talked about the safety mechanics of switching to that and what that looked like and how she could keep herself safe online. And that was actually something that was looked down upon at the agency. They're like, you can't tell a survivor to engage in sex work. You have to tell them not to engage in sex work so that they can stay in services, right? Because otherwise we could be seen as promoting the practice of sex work, right? We could lose all of our funding for our shelter if we safety plan with clients, or if we do advocacy in a way that speaks to our clients' needs. So this exists in the majority of human trafficking specific funding. So this is one of the reasons. The other is an incredible faith-based influence. So I want to acknowledge that faith-based communities have a history in many anti-violence movements of doing incredible grassroots-based work. And when I say faith-based, I do mean a lot of faiths. Specifically right now in the human trafficking movement, I do mean Christian and or Catholic influences. The human trafficking movement specifically has a foundation and continued presence of faith-based involvement that's continued this like moralization of human trafficking. I have pulled this screenshot off of the website of a prominent global human trafficking organization. And they list, you know, the numbers of human trafficking survivors worldwide next to the followers of Christ and next to people who have not heard of Christ. I don't know how they're getting these numbers also. This seems like a really difficult thing to do a study on. But this is very common in the human trafficking movement, is that you will see that human trafficking is framed as a moral failing of our culture, as opposed to a natural consequence of not taking care of our people in a capitalist system, right? People who have no access to safe immigration, safe employment, safe housing, who are constantly criminalized, who don't have access to resources, instead of it being kind of the culmination of societal factors, it's considered a moral failing of us not, you know, engaging in this way. Another thing is sting operations and the rescue industry. So this is also something that a lot of sexual violence advocates have come to us and been a little confused about, is that, you know, what is all of this rescue language? Why is the human trafficking movement always talking about rescuing people? And a lot of the assumption is that, okay, well, human trafficking must just be really different than domestic and sexual violence. It must be so different that the language is completely different. And I will say, I mean, I was an emergency response case manager for years. My primary job was working 24/7 to assist people with escaping their traffickers. That sometimes included working with law enforcement. Most of the time it did not. I do understand the complexities, and I do understand that sometimes people will need assistance in physically leaving a space. But this is not the primary reason for this type of language. The primary reason for this type of language is sting operations. So a sting operation most commonly utilized in the anti-trafficking field is one in which buyers, sex workers, and trafficking survivors are arrested and then screened to see if they are survivors. And if they are still arrested, but they are sent into a service provider. This is the primary intervention tactic utilized in task force models of anti-trafficking work. And if you Google really anything about human trafficking, you are often going to see that you're going to see that we cite a lot of victims rescued. It just is cited everywhere. this operation rescued 500 people. This operation rescued 47 people. You will never find a definition of what rescued means because it does not mean anything other than arrested, usually. It has no outcome basis. It has no output basis. Oftentimes, they're not even using a standardized definition of trafficking. So oftentimes, anybody arrested for solicitation, they're going to net as a rescued victim. It doesn't tell us how many people went into safe housing, does not tell us how many people experienced force, fraud, or coercion, does not tell us how many people accepted services and for how long and what the outcome was, if they felt supported. But you will see that oftentimes people will state victims rescued, and at the core of that, there is arrest as the form of outreach. So we would not do this in any other social movement, but arrest is a primary form of outreach in the human trafficking movement in that, and this is what I meant about bodily autonomy and supporting survivors' decisions. Oftentimes, the primary refrain I hear is we have to arrest them because they don't know any better. They don't know that they're being exploited. They don't know that sex work is exploitative. They don't know that they need to be rescued. So we have to arrest them in order to get through to them. And if I said that about domestic violence, you all would kick me out of this meeting. You would absolutely tell me to leave. You'd be like, never trust that person again. They don't know what they're talking about. But then you all enter human trafficking spaces and the experts are telling you that this is what needs to happen. And sometimes it's very difficult to stand in your values because maybe you're not an expert on human trafficking. And so something else that you're going to see a lot of, especially as funding opportunities, is what's called the Enhanced Collaborative Task Force Model. So this is a multidisciplinary approach to fight human trafficking with a co-leadership model where the decision-making is shared by law enforcement and a nonprofit. The goal is that these two people will co-lead and work together to have the main areas be support survivors, connect them to services, prosecute traffickers, and do joint operations together. My main issue with this model is that the funding was pulled away from services. This is co-funded by OVC and the DOJ, and the OVC funding was pulled away from direct services in order to fund this type of law enforcement collaboration. But, and with some very hard work by some advocates, even this model is speaking out on end-demand operations. So as of this funding cycle, you can no longer utilize this funding to arrest buyers and sex workers and then screen for survivors. That is no longer considered an anti-trafficking operation. It is considered an anti-prostitution or anti-sex work operation, which that is a crime that law enforcement address, but it cannot be done using anti-trafficking funding. They have to have prior knowledge of survivors who need assistance in leaving, right? So this is now, even in this model, which I don't consider the best model, even this model is shifting away from that type of operation. But this is the most common model that I actually see sexual violence agencies apply for, generally because it's easy to get, especially if you live in a place that doesn't have a human trafficking service provider. This could be easy money to obtain, but it's just important to think about if it aligns with your values. We also see some common programming restrictions that you don't see in the sexual violence and domestic violence movement. So very commonly, human trafficking service providers will exclusively or greatly prioritize referrals from law enforcement. And that is their primary kind of like entry point for services. Oftentimes, they also will allow for court mandated or diversion programming for solicitation charges. But you will see that they will prioritize only those survivors identified by law enforcement, which brings into question who is law enforcement seeing as worthy of services and who are they seeing as believable in their reports. You will also see a common element of empowerment-based human trafficking programming is the requirement that survivors no longer be engaged in the sex trade, even if there's no force, fraud, or coercion present. Because oftentimes a benchmark of success for a survivor in these programs is not that they are safe, is not that they are in school, is not that, any of these things, is that they are no longer engaged in the commercial sex trade, whether that be a legal branch of the commercial sex trade, an illegal branch, no matter what the safety is, even if there's no force, fraud, or coercion present. And you will see that a lot of these programs have rules that if a survivor then goes and consensually engages in the sex trade, they'll be removed from services. that is considered like a reason for a person to be exited from services. And this will really surprise sexual violence advocates and domestic violence advocates because it's not something that we would be familiar with or that we would engage in. This isn't what we would consider empowerment-based programs. So what's important to think about when you are engaging in human trafficking work and you're asked to engage in maybe end demand or maybe criminalization-based work, it's important to think about, has this worked in other issue areas? And I think we can learn a lot from other movements. So one of those being the drug trade, or working with folks who utilize substances. Criminalization does not decrease someone's, ability or their likelihood of selling drugs in the future or using drugs in the future. Criminalization actually tends to have the opposite effect on someone's likelihood of selling or using drugs in the future. I've also had, there's again, a lot of Catholic influence into the human trafficking movement. So I talk to a lot of nuns on like a semi-regular basis about many, many issues. And we've drawn parallels to abortion, where a lot of nuns who, me believing that everyone should have access to abortion and them believing that abortion is a thing that we should reduce, have found common ground on how that would occur. Because criminalizing them isn't going to mean that abortion rates will go down. But if you actually look at what would make that rate go down, which is increased access to comprehensive sex ed, it is increased access to free healthcare, contraception, financial assistance for parents, all of these things that we would actually both agree on as great programs. We have very different kind of like outcomes in mind, but we have to look at, for any other issue areas, criminalization really what has worked to keep people safe. And does criminalization in general lead to increased safety and protective factors for our communities? I worked very closely with a survivor whose father had been arrested a lot for solicitation and had been arrested for soliciting sex workers, and at one point soliciting a minor. And that person grew up without a father because that father was incarcerated. And we had a lot of interesting conversations about if her life may have been different if her father was in her life, or if that was the tactic that would have stopped her father from engaging in that behavior. Or we just had a lot of really wonderful conversations, a lot of really difficult, nuanced conversations around the general criminalization of our communities. And if any criminalization of our communities leads to increased safety, or if there are other deeper upstream issues that we should be looking at. And then, are we listening to a diversity of impacted voices? Every movement I know struggles greatly with listening to survivors. This is across the board. The human trafficking movement in particular has a real issue with only uplifting certain voices, certain impacted voices. Again, I've been in meetings where I've stated my opinion and someone told me that I must be lying about being trafficked, that my trafficking must have not been that bad, that I must be secretly a trafficker if I, am saying the things like that I'm saying in this training. And we're not really listening to a diversity of impacted voices, mostly because most of them do not feel safe in this movement. They do not feel safe engaging with the human trafficking movement. There are so many people who have experienced force, fraud, and coercion in some form of labor that do not feel safe engaging with us. So are we listening to other movements and to other survivors who meet that definition but aren't yet in this room? How do we open this room? How do we get more people to this table? We really want to look at if things are evidence-based. This is a hard one because human trafficking has been moralized. It is a moral issue. It creates moral panic. But we do still need to invest in and look at evidence-based, peer-reviewed literature to see which tactics are hurting or helping our communities. And something that we often talk about at our agency is this tactic causing harm to end harm? And is that something that we want to do? So CAST has a history of working in an enhanced collaborative task force model up until very recently, when we decided that that tactic was causing more harm than it was ending for us and for our clients, right? So we can make decisions and also learn from them and also change those, tactics that we utilize, but we try not to engage in tactics that cause harm to end it, right? So is the practice of arrest as outreach causing more harm? in this lofty goal of ending harm completely? And are there other ways and other tactics that don't cause harm that we could utilize? And so, like, how did we at any point get to some of these conclusions, and what does that look like? Our National Survivor Network has always been a really vibrant community and a place of learning, and they've gone through a lot of different political and theoretical debates and discussions internally. But I remember in 2016, we did a survey, and these are adult sex and labor trafficking survivors, though many of them, like as children, but are now adults, who are in advocacy now, who are choosing to engage in the movement. Over 90% of our network had been arrested or convicted at some point in their life. 40% had been arrested 9 times or more. 41.6% were arrested as minors, most of them living in states in which you cannot arrest a minor for the things that they were arrested for, but those laws often take a long time to trickle down into actual practice. All of our respondents reported significant barriers to healing because of their criminal records. So half of our respondents reported that they believed that their arrest was directly related to their trafficking. And the vast majority, the vast majority, were arrested on prostitution-related charges. So 65.3% for prostitution, 42.7% for solicitation, and 25.3% for intent to solicit. A lot of them arrested in the process of being helped, right? We also had a lot of folks arrested, 40% for drug possession and about 9% for drug sales, 60% for like a lot of other related crimes outside of drug and prostitution related charges. But what these arrests did was delay healing, even if the arrest was well-intentioned, because a criminal record in the United States often means that you are not eligible for safe immigration. You are more likely to be deported. You are not eligible for custody, or you have your custody taken away. You're not eligible for public housing. You're not eligible for public benefits. You're not eligible for safe employment. All this does is make someone more susceptible to being trafficked again. And a lot of survivors that we talked to were arrested for things not related to solicitation, but when they were working in the sex trade. So police come in, they arrest the buyer, but then you have drugs on you, so you get arrested. Or you have a warrant out, so you get arrested. Or you did something that conveys resisting arrest, so you get arrested. Or you have a list on you, in a Discord about which clients are safe or not. Now you are pimping and pandering. Now you are soliciting human trafficking just by trying to keep other people safe. So when we talk to a lot of survivors about the arrest that they experienced, this is what really started to kind of like shift a lot of our models, was just around direct feedback that we got. These 2 QR codes, because we're fancy, we're doing QR codes now, even though I don't like, they frustrate me, but people seem to like them. This is the future. Both of these link to literature reviews and other like kind of hubs of information where you can read about end demand and the way that it causes harm. And remember when I told you that no one is the exclusive authority on all things human trafficking? I invite you to engage this information in the way that feels good for you. And again, take what serves you, integrate it into your system, and we're all people who are capable of learning. And also, there's a lot of nuance here, right? You might have a job with law enforcement, or like you might be your rape crisis centers task force coordinator. There's still a lot of this information that you can utilize to shift power and structures and practices. So I'll also send these out at the end. So if you can't get your fancy QR codes to work, no worry, we'll send them out at the end as well. So how has all of this information, so we just went over like a ton of stuff about the history, about common practices, about all of these things. How has this impacted the sexual violence movement? This is what I'm hearing from advocates, and this is what I experienced when I entered. I was confused about the values and practices used. I was like, that doesn't quite feel right. I'm really confused about some of these choices, but I also felt disregarded. I didn't feel like the expert. I was like, wow, I'm an expert in like so many different forms of violence. I have worked, with I've worked at a domestic violence shelter. I've worked in a rape crisis center. I have, run support groups for trans children. I have worked, with incarcerated survivors of violence. I've done so many different things, and yet I've been disregarded in this space. My expertise is not welcome here. My influence in other movements doesn't seem to be of use. And I felt apprehensive. I didn't know how to collaborate. I didn't know how to best serve survivors. And I thought, if I'm so confused and disregarded, maybe I'm not the best person to be engaged in this work. Maybe I should leave this to these experts that are shutting me down. I also felt forced to engage in harmful tactics and partnerships to maintain funding and relationships. And this is something I know exists across all movements in the nonprofit industrial complex, is that we are bound by funding and relationships that we need to maintain strategically in order to do our work. But this is especially true in the human trafficking movement. This section is one of Chris's sections. I'm going to do my best to knock this section out of the park like they normally do. But they've talked a lot about, Chris is somebody who has gotten a lot of people to come to a lot of common understanding. And that also comes from running a national network of survivors of human trafficking. Survivors are not a monolith. We don't all think the same things. We're actually all very different. And getting a big group of us to agree on even one thing can be really challenging. So they've come up with these different ideas of and ways of thinking about people and where they are with their knowledge in order to have generative conflict. When we say generative conflict, right, I don't want us all to agree. I don't think that that's healthy necessarily either. I want everyone's unique and nuanced perspective, but we do want the conflict to be generative. We want it to lead somewhere. We want it to be evidence-based and center lived experience. We want to do all of these things. So they kind of came up with this idea of how to look at some folks specifically around end demand, but it relates to all equity issues that we've kind of talked about. But these are kind of the 4 criteria. So somebody who has knowledge of the research demonstrating the harms of end demand, or of anything, of, harmful immigration practices, kind of fill in the blank. Maybe they're unaware of the research. They're kind of aware, they're vaguely familiar, or they are aware. They have a position, they support, they're unsure, they're confused, they're on the fence, or they oppose. Are they willing to support efforts, maybe behind the scenes, in front of the scenes? Maybe they're unwilling, maybe willing and able, who knows? Are they able and willing to create explicit anti-trafficking resources that do not use end demand strategies, or offering alternatives rather than just critique? They're willing to engage in that generative conflict. So we have our typologies. They're the ideologue, the learner, the movable middle, the resistor, the researcher, the ally, the advocate. So first we have the ideologue, right? So this person, believes that any and all commercial sex commodifies bodies in ways that other forms of labors, doesn't. They believe that all sex work is sex trafficking, and this is not something they're willing to move on. They know about the research, but it doesn't change what they believe, because what they hold is a moral belief about human trafficking or about sex work. They may be unmovable, but many people turn to them for guidance because they create accessible narratives. Oftentimes, these types of organizations that kind of fall under this typology are really great at marketing. I'm working with a survivor currently who assisted a very well-known organization who kind of falls under this category with a fundraising campaign using her story. And then she found out that all of the money that it raised went into the next fundraising campaign. And that was not where she thought that money was going. So a lot of times really great fundraising campaigns fund more fundraising campaigns. It's a very expensive line of work. Some of the values that they de-emphasize might be bodily autonomy. They might say, no, it's not about bodily autonomy. It's not about consent. People don't know that they're not consenting. They don't know that they don't have autonomy over this situation. I remind people that sex workers and sex trafficking survivors are a Venn diagram. They're not separate populations. A lot of us actually have identified as both at different parts in our journey. People can technically, by definition, experience both at different times. And people have the ability to feel about their experiences and use whatever words they can. We like to ethically leverage compelling narratives. So this is something that can be really challenging to do. We're actually releasing a whole framework and guide on the way that the movements use survivor stories in really harmful ways, and how can we ethically compensate and center people's stories when they do want to share. So that's why, when I first entered the human trafficking movement, I never thought that I would disclose that I was a survivor. I was like, not like over my dead body. I'm never going to tell anybody. I'm here for like 5 minutes until I can get back into a rape crisis center. And then I ended up staying and sharing because I didn't see my narrative anymore, not in one place. And then when I tried to share it, I got a lot of pushback. And then I was like, oh, this is why I don't see me anywhere, because I've been asked to leave, right? So that is part of the reason that folks will stay. So you'll often see this with like faith-based or law enforcement. And so really all we can do here is just like offer alternative resources, offer alternative ways of engaging, really highlight the harms of criminalization, right? This is not a time to get into a debate about if sex work is work, right? This is a time to get into a debate about like what harm is existing and what are alternative, more ethical strategies. So then we have the learner, people who are in like a learning space. They value being of service. They value learning. They're often not sure. They're like, there's conflicting information. I don't know. I'm just doing the best I can with all of these like conflicting narratives. They often attend trainings. They're often reading materials. But like we talked about, those materials that are most easily accessible have really harmful practices. They have statistics that come from nowhere. I have a great article on debunking most of the statistics used in the human trafficking movement that we just kind of pulled out of thin air one day and they really stuck around. With folks like this, I like to just let people know that I'm really comfortable with uncertainty. I think being a learner is like a really cool thing. I think being open to learning is a superpower. And like acknowledging that you don't know everything is like a place that you can exist in. And reminding folks that human trafficking is a criminal combination of a bunch of other forms of violence. I often find sexual violence advocates stuck in this like typology. I'm like, I'm just learning. I'm like, you've been the director of a rape crisis center for 20 years. I get that you're just learning, but you have a boatload of expertise in this movement and in other movements. And human trafficking, remember, it's not the exception. It's the culmination of many forms of oppression. So that I often try to coax out of learners like, well, what do you know, in this movement, what are your values? How does that apply? So the movable middle values accountability and safety. And you'll often hear people in the movable middle say, everybody in the human trafficking movement, including every survivor I've ever heard from, supports demand reduction, right? So that's what I know. I'm following what, I'm being told. And oftentimes these people like support sexual autonomy, but they want to hold traffickers accountable, right? They want to like make sure that like we're really relying on the criminal legal system to hold traffickers accountable, to prosecute them, and that being the best way forward. And oftentimes they haven't seen the research about how demand reduction criminalizes survivors and their safety practices. They haven't quite seen that. They've only heard that it criminalizes buyers and traffickers, and that doesn't sound too bad. So that's probably good, but they haven't heard about the unintended impacts in which it also criminalizes survivors. We also see the resistor. So I work with a lot of folks that fall into this typology who refuse to come anywhere near the human trafficking movement. This is where I used to live. I was in the sexual violence movement and I really valued accountability for systemic harm. I really valued non-carceral options. I was all evidence-based, all grassroots, all day. So I was like, I'm not going anywhere near that hot mess of a movement. I'm like, it's just not for me. It doesn't value my story. Or you might hear somebody say, I used to do anti-trafficking work, or I tried, and then I realized that I couldn't get the kind of change, and I left to do harm reduction work. I left to do other kinds of work. And they may have really good reason for not engaging. And they may also be engaging in other work that aligns. And I think that's the biggest struggle that the human trafficking movement has, is it doesn't oftentimes collaborate outside of itself. So harm reduction, immigration, prison abolition, all of these things have extreme overlaps with human trafficking. We don't necessarily collaborate because we hold such different values. So figuring out ways that we can collaborate. I like to remember that trust is earned. Sometimes people don't want to collaborate, and that's okay. I'm trying to be conscious of any power dynamics and tone policing that I might be bringing into the room. And I never assume someone's survivorship in any of these categories, but especially in this resistor. Never assume that someone's a survivor or a sex worker or whatever if they're not disclosing, right, I'm not assuming, but I am trying to just like reflect that I also value accountability and I can hold those values with them. We also have the researcher. So these are folks that are like really into the evidence-based sides of things, often include partnerships between practitioners, impacted populations. They're really into process and outcome. And oftentimes they are not able to engage because of government contracts or because of the position that they hold. They can be really useful for building partnerships. They can be really useful for finding research. I have so many amazing like public health department folks are like, they can't really engage in any movement because it would bias the research that they're doing. But they're really great when I'm like, hey, I heard this today at a training. I heard that this causes harm. I'm feeling a little lost. Do you have anything? And they're really great at like, I have everything. Actually, I can find all of the research everywhere about everything. And I can break it down for you. They can be really, really great partnerships to build. And then you can invite them to train and mentor folks. I find research to be one of the hardest fields to break into for people with lived experience. And so when we talk about centering impacted populations, we often talk about centering them in campaigns or centering them in lower level positions at an organization, but we don't often talk about centering them in like all positions, and research is definitely one of them. So like recently we were able to get a local researcher to mentor a survivor who's interested in becoming a researcher and like walk them through what that process looks like. So they can be really helpful there as well. So then we have the ally. They value perceived safety, collaboration. They want to shift the needle. But they oftentimes, and this is what was so interesting to me when I entered the human trafficking movement, is that I found people like, I don't know, on their own Twitter saying like really progressive things. And then I'd find out like, oh, they are the person who runs all of the task forces. They're like the lead of everything, right? Or they have like this very interesting position where I was like, wow, it seems like your values are in contradiction with maybe like your position. They're like, yeah, it is. I'm doing work from the inside. That's a tactic that some people choose to utilize. Not everybody agrees with that tactic or think that's helpful, but a lot of times you'll find allies in that position where they can be really, really good for helping you find grant funding. They can be really good for any kind of like internal shift that needs to happen. Yes, maybe it's a task force, but maybe you can help get them to remind everybody about that new funding restriction and also, get information from the inside. So allies can be really, really helpful for that kind of collaboration and shifting the needle. The advocate, this is folks who maybe value ethics over morality, that like perceived morality around human trafficking. They're really into how to translate evidence into practice. Not just sticking to the science, but like what does this look like on the ground? And they're really good at holding complexity and nuance. So if this is you, just remember that this is often a place of privilege. It often comes from being in the movement for a very long time, having space and time to be safe enough in your own like economic and personal circle to have space to learn and process and do all of these things. And you may have allies in multiple groups that typically don't work together well. You can use this position to bring people together. Something that really struck me is that somebody that I work with who is an incredible like sex worker rights policy activist, I find out has like a monthly meeting with the leader of like a religious anti-trafficking org where they talk policy. And I was like, is that a friendly talk? And she was like, no, it's not. It's a little tense, but we agree to keep coming back to it. And I bring in other perspectives for us to both hear from because I have the privilege to do that. I have the space and the time to bring people together to start to have these really nuanced and difficult conversations because I am in a place in my journey where, this is something that's accessible to me. And they're always really conscious of power dynamics and especially when survivors are involved. So the advocate also can be a really wonderful place to be. Those typologies, those can be helpful for folks, especially if you find yourself often stuck in debate. So if you don't yet, you're like, I'm still like even trying to figure out what's going on. That's totally fine. If you find yourself often like stuck in debate with human trafficking folks or folks about equity, you can try to figure out like, where are they in this typology? Like, are they confused? Are they morally outraged? Are they bound by contract? Like, where are they? What do they value? And how can we best collaborate? So how do we, as two movements and sectors, collaborate effectively and prevent violence? Right? Because I could just do a training on how do we collaborate effectively. And that would be about funding and structures, and it would be kind of surface level. But how do we collaborate and uphold our own values and prevent violence to survivors? Something that we're really big on, right, is the public health model of human trafficking. So utilizing the prevention principles from the social ecological model. This can get like real pretentious really fast with like public health academic stuff. So I'm going to try not to do that. But we look at human trafficking like we look at everything else that is community violence, right? We look at it on all levels. We look on it as what's happening to individuals, what's happening to relationships, what's happening to communities, what's happening to society. We don't silo any type of crime to just one level. We look at that crime across levels. And we look at risk factors, what increases the likelihood of violence occurring, even if it's not causal, in each of these categories. And importantly, what is a protective factor? What decreases the likelihood of violence occurring? Oftentimes, we don't talk about protective factors in human trafficking. If you go to any human trafficking 101 training in the community, you will likely get a list of red flags, and that's it. They'll just be like, look out for these red flags. And they're just like a list of stereotypes generally, or it kind of like narrows it into only one kind of trafficking. We don't really talk about protective factors. We don't really talk about what we're going to do to protect our community, what decreases the likelihood of violence occurring on an individual, a relationship, and a community level. So the goal of prevention should be to reduce the risk factors and to increase the protective factors across all the levels. So something that's very common in the public health sphere is like a precede proceed model. We're not going to get into all that, but risk and protective factors, right? The things that increase and decrease that likelihood of violence can be predisposing, things about a person's life that make them more likely to cause or experience harm. And notice it says cause and experience. So we're not just talking about people who experience harm. People who cause harm is two separate and distinct things, right? There are so many times in which someone who has experienced violence perpetrates violence. Whether that violence be a human trafficking survivor perpetrating the crime of human trafficking, or somebody who witnessed domestic violence becoming an abuser. We know that people who experience harm often cause harm. We do have to look at both if we are to do true prevention. They can be predisposing, they can also be enabling. Things that exist that make something possible. It can also be reinforcing. It's a tactic that rewards or conditions a behavior. Risk and protective factors, as well as being predisposing, enabling, and reinforcing, can be behavioral, be attitude, and be environmental. Things we do, things we believe, and things that are in people's environments and communities. And so this can all be a little challenging to look at, but we need to focus on things outside of just reinforcing individual behavior, which is a lot of what the human trafficking movement pursues, is things that reinforce behavior. Doesn't really look at why that behavior occurred, what things in the environment are present, what predisposes or enables, but really just reinforces that behavior. So this is another way to kind of look at some of those things, is the level of factors, the order of factors, and the type of factor. And our funding really only focuses on individual reinforcing behavior. And that is what End Demand focuses on. It focuses on arrest being the reinforcing factor that reinforces or enables a behavior of an individual. There's not a lot of funding available to do community or relationship-based work to look at behavior or to look at attitude and environment, or to look at what predisposes and enables someone to becoming a trafficker or becoming a survivor of trafficking. And so one of the quotes I like to utilize, oh, my quote is gone. That's okay. I'll just read it. One of the quotes that I like to utilize when I'm talking about human trafficking, I got this from Sienna Baskin, who's a funder, a funder who's has a history of grassroots organizing. we got into talking about the type of funding structures that are available for human trafficking. And I remember she said that human trafficking is the criminal expression, political and economic disenfranchisement. Human trafficking is the criminal expression, political and economic disenfranchisement. And she utilizes this quotes to educate funders on why we need broader prevention funding available for human trafficking, and why many people in the sexual and domestic violence movements are actually already doing primary prevention for human trafficking. If they are engaging in street-based non-judgmental outreach, if they are engaging in harm reduction, if they are engaging in community healing, if they are engaging all these things, that often is more successful at preventing human trafficking than the criminalization of individual behavior. I want to briefly kind of go over the values shift at the National Survivor Network. So the National Survivor Network is a program of CAST. It is entirely survivor-led and autonomous and directed by our team. And they made a choice to transition to a stated human rights and public health framework that was led and developed by survivors. If you want more information on like who were these survivors and were they all of a certain identity and like who was at the table to make these decisions, all of that's available on our website. If you want to dive in more, we're not going to dive too far into these, but I do want to go over them so that you all can see what would a human rights and public health set of values out of an anti-trafficking organization look like. So we start at the top with that we utilize the operational definition. And as you guys remember, there's a non-operational and an operational definition of human trafficking, with, of course, the exception of someone who is in the sex trades as a minor. We believe in trauma-informed nonviolent communication, building survivor-centric cultures of care. We emphasize collective goals, share facilitation, listening, and promote informed, inclusive, and equitable dialogue over debate, right? That generative container for conflict, that's what we're trying to create. So we promote a public health framework and a human rights approach to anti-trafficking efforts. We seek to end human trafficking without co-opting the language of slavery or abolition. This is hotly debated in the human trafficking community. One of the things that we talk about is that the United States has a history of chattel slavery. So utilizing the word slavery to refer to an illegal practice when slavery still exists in a legal practice inside of our prison system is insensitive to our history and our current political condition. So that is a statement they made that you can read more about. We also acknowledge that all human trafficking exploits an individual's body and mind, and that trafficking in the sex trades is not inherently more traumatic, grievous, or important to address than trafficking in other forms of labor, as different forms of trauma cannot be measured or compared. There are many labor trafficking survivors that have experienced parallel experiences to those of sex trafficking, and many people who have experienced both sex and labor trafficking. And we reject notions that one is more important to address politically or through services than another. We acknowledge that human trafficking is horrific and is an extension rather than an exception to the range of exploitation inherent in capitalist systems of labor. We acknowledge that injustices experienced disproportionately by people of the global majority are rooted in systemic and historic oppression of these people and communities. We acknowledge that labor trafficking is underreported due to an increased emphasis on trafficking in the sex trades and awareness and prevention campaigns, as well as media coverage and service provision. We oppose the use of forced labor or exploited labor in prisons. We acknowledge the conflation of consensual and trafficked engagement in the sex trades and acknowledge that not all adults in the sex trade have been trafficked. We believe that social policy and norms like immigration, anti-Black racism, homelessness can either prevent or drive trafficking by decreasing or increasing vulnerability. And that's why the NSN engages in public policy. We do not advocate for causing harm to end harm, including and demand practices that harm people in the sex trades, whether consensual or trafficked. We call for an end to law enforcement ever having sexual contact with individuals in custody or potential victims ever having sexual contact while acting under color of law. This should not be hotly debated in the human trafficking movement, but it is. Yes, okay. So we are opposed to that being an investigative tactic that law enforcement can use under color of law. So we promote harm reduction, sharing information and resources that help people in the sex trades to stay safer and healthier, and an end to stigma and criminalization for people in the sex trades. We recognize that many of our members work for organizations that are federally funded and are expected to follow the anti-prostitution pledge in their work. As organizations receiving U.S. funding to certify that they will not promote or advocate the legalization or practice of prostitution or sex trafficking. Sharing safety resources and research is not promoting sex work or sex trafficking. We oppose criminalizing survivors for their trafficking experiences and support holistic and comprehensive vacatur expansion for all human trafficking survivors. That just means criminal record expungement, so that they should have access to clear their criminal records. The NSN supports the right to permanent resident status and equitable visa protections, as well as path to citizenship for non-citizen survivors of trafficking. We support meaningful survivor leadership in both the sector and the movement rather than tokenized contributions, the mitigation of power dynamics over when and how survivors choose to tell their stories, and a movement whose frameworks are big enough to accommodate and advocate for survivors whose narratives have been historically ignored or invalidated. So oftentimes when agencies come to me and they want to do human trafficking work, they have an idea of a program they want to do. They have an idea of like a funding stream. And I ask them to take a step back and tell me what their values are. Because this is incredibly important once you enter this movement and once you start to enter these collaborations, it's important that you internally figure out what are your values around bodily autonomy, around the sex trade, around consent, around immigration, about how power dynamics impact all sexual consent, right? About how power dynamics and economic coercion and capitalism impact all income producing labor. Unfortunately, it's really hard to figure out what these values are when you're in the midst of the work, because these values are going to be impacted by funding and other things. So it's important on the front end to think about what are your values and where do you need more information? Where do you need to learn more from survivors and other experts on some of these topics? And so what do strategies for effective collaboration look like? And these are just a few. But I like to state that you should recognize that human trafficking is complex, right? There are things about it that you aren't going to know, right? You might not know what a T visa is and how long it takes to get and what are the steps to take it, right? And that it exists within a larger framework of anti-violence expertise, right? That you have expertise as someone in the anti-violence movement. Therefore, you do have expertise on human trafficking. You do have something to contribute. You do have knowledge that is important, because human trafficking does not exist in a vacuum away from sexual violence or domestic violence or immigration or drug use or any of the other issues that we are all working around. Human trafficking should not be the exception to your value system. If you have a value system, human trafficking should not be the exception to it. So oftentimes a rape crisis center might hire a human trafficking expert or case manager. And for whatever reason, the intake is different. The program rules are different. The values are different, because it's different, because it's human trafficking. It's got to be different. We've got to do the extra intakes. We've got to have the different rules. It shouldn't be the exception to your values. You should aim to understand the complexities and integrate into your value system. We should really work to follow evidence-based models of intervention and prevention. And I say evidence-based because that's not often what's most popular. And I think that gets confused. They're like, oh, well, we interviewed, 4 human trafficking service providers and they all do this, so we're going to do that. But is that the evidence-based model that is going to cause the least amount of harm and is supported for intervention and prevention? Something to think about. Here, I might have said, like, don't align with funding or partnerships that go against your value system. But here I'm just going to say acknowledge if your funding or partnerships don't align with your values. I do understand that funding and partnerships are difficult. So for example, right, you may end your relationship with a certain branch of law enforcement because of treatment, but somebody on your board of directors is in government and really wants to see that relationship. Or, you might take human trafficking funding, and even though you are a place that does harm reduction work, you might now find yourself under that anti-prostitution pledge. So how are you going to align your values with those restrictions? Have you outwardly acknowledged them and the way they're impacting your services? And before you pursue a new partnership or a new funding stream, figure out, do they align with those values? I think for effective collaboration, you and the person you're collaborating with have to commit to continued self-reflection and learning and engagement with the sector, right? We have to engage with each other. We have to have these conversations. We have to continue self-reflecting and learning and create those containers for generative conflict. We have to continue to improve our services, right? As service providers, as people working at nonprofits, there's a history of harm that we've caused to people through really abusive policies, through bad legislation. And we have to own all of that and commit to doing better, right? We can't just kind of like bury our head in the sand about the harm that we've caused. And we have to remember that survivors are not a monolith. You cannot have one survivor come speak and then just do everything that that survivor says and say nothing that we do is harmful because there was a survivor involved. And the survivor told us to do this, so that means that it is right. I see this happen quite a bit, and people fall into this really kind of lazy trap of, no, it's fine. One survivor said that we can do this program, so there can't be any harm in it because we got permission. You want to listen to a diversity of voices. You want to listen to a diversity of voices and then see how that aligns with your values. And then you want to listen more and again, and you want to branch outside of who feels safe reaching out to you and who can you build trust with so that they can give you feedback. You want to also be listening to the people in your care, the people who you are serving. They are probably the greatest piece of feedback that you can get about your services and your programs. So we left a little bit of time for questions at the end. We're also going to send around a survey. But I do want to say that I know that this was a lot of information and you're going to get the slides. You're definitely going to get a survey. I'm available for chats, for coffee, for any of those things. If you want to dive in more, I know some of the topics today, especially around end demand, can be uncomfortable to unpack. Again, especially if you have lived experience, especially if you are an advocate with a passion for making sure people are healthy and safe and having their rights respected. So just know that, again, this is not a space where we're going to like get into a lot of super heavy debate, but I'm happy to answer questions that anybody might have. Thank you.
Okay, I'm seeing someone did just ask a question. And also just lots of thank yous to you, Lee. So thank you so much. And Katrina's asking, can you explain more about how you understand sexual contact? And we might need a little bit more context for that, Katrina.
Yeah, so it's around value 13, where we call for an end for law enforcement ever having sexual contact with individuals in custody. So a lot of the information we get is one, law enforcement can actually have sex with someone as a way to prove that they're a sex worker. That's a legal tactic that they can use in their investigation. We don't want that to occur. But also many trafficking survivors and sex workers just report being propositioned, being groped, being touched, being assaulted by law enforcement during their arrest. So those are, we want under, we want not only for there to be like law enforcement be held accountable for like sexual harassment and assault, but that sexual contact should not be an investigative tactic to prove that someone is a sex worker, which it currently is able to be used as. Y'all are so sweet.
And then we have another question asking, do you have any resources that you can share around more harm to end harm in direct service work for sexual violence? Yeah.
I will see if I do. It's a big question around harm. Like every time I give a presentation, I can see like 8 things in my presentation that could be their own presentation that like could just be like taken out and put into somebody else's like expertise level. But yeah, there are some good, I mean, the sexual violence movement has like had this reckoning a bit sooner than the human trafficking movement. I will say, this is something that we used to talk about a lot. We used to talk about, oh, is our intake too much? You know, is it re-traumatizing the survivor that we're working with? Or like, is this partnership with this law enforcement agency? Is this making survivors feel safe? Is it worth, you know, we've like had a lot of these conversations, but I'll definitely see if I can find some resources about that topic in particular. And then on the NSN's website, also, each of those values break off into like a big description of like, why do we think this? And what does it mean? I just didn't put it all in here because it would have been quite a lot. But if you're curious, you can check out the website, and there's even articles about some. You can have the page read aloud just because we were like, it's a lot of information. Thank you, Marcella.
Any other questions? And if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, feel free to raise your hand. I know sometimes I feel more comfortable asking questions in that way. And I did drop a survey in the chat, so please do fill that out and give Lee some feedback. Drop it in the chat again.
I'll drop my email in case folks want to chat.
We give it like one more minute and then we will end if we don't have any other questions.
It looks like we have a hand.
All right, Katrina, I think you can unmute yourself already, so go for it. Whatever question you have for us.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for the presentation, Leah. I'm wondering if there's anything as someone working with an agency that is, though I'm not involved with it, looking more at approaches to demand. Is there any literature or information you can recommend to me that I might put forward to them to kind of think about when they're thinking about that as something they want to invest their time in?
Yeah, absolutely. I know you put it in the chat, Marcella, but there's those 2 QR codes are all literature about demand, like demand strategies, like what are the impact, the outcomes, like what happens when we implement them. It's a lot to read through. So if you're not like a research person, it overwhelms me to like stare at a big bucket of research. But there are a few in there that are like more geared towards nonprofits who are engaging in that work. But only one of the links was shared in the chat. When I send out the slides, I'll definitely send out both links just to make sure that we can get them all.
Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, and a great article that Claudia put in the chat from Reframe Health and Justice.
Yeah, Lee, if you send me the 2 or 3 links, I think that you have QR codes for, I can include that in the newsletter and then also hyperlink it into the webpage. So
awesome.
Get it again. Oh, I think Claudia actually dropped them in the chat. Any other questions, folks? No more. All right. Well, with that said, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to Lee. Please send your thank yous and gratitude to Lee. Did a wonderful job providing such comprehensive information from the history way back when to all the way to present day and the changes that we're trying to build here. So I hope we can all continue collaborating with each other and learning. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.